for a glimpse into our historical, cultural, and natural heritage, North Carolina Scenic Byways presents Forest Heritage. This rugged mountainous terrain isolated its people, but offered the promise of abundant natural resources. In the early 1800s, European settlers began to move into these mountain areas using the Wagon Gap Road, which connected Brevard to the Pigeon River Gorge and Tennessee. When they arrived, they built homes from the forests that surrounded them and grew or raised their own food. Since general stores could only be found in the larger communities, they had to make almost everything they needed to live comfortably in this environment. To start our journey back through time and experience mountaineer life, we visit a special place on the Forest Heritage Byway, the Cradle of Forestry in America. Here, along the Biltmore Campus Trail, you can stop at authentic sites to see how folks might have lived in earlier times. At these old cabins, craftspeople of today demonstrate the skills homesteaders needed to survive. The fireplace was the central part of the small house. It was a source of heat and where all the cooking took place. Here's how biscuits were made. Cast iron pots with fresh dough placed inside were set on top of hot coals pulled from the fire. Coals placed on top of the lid allowed the biscuits to cook on the bottom and top. Finally, biscuits were ready to serve and brought to the kitchen table. The furniture was rustic and plain. Tables, chairs, benches were built by hand from a variety of different woods, such as hickory, maple, or oak, that grew in the forest around them. The hand tools they used, like the frame saw, plane, axe, and hammer, took longer to use than our power tools do today. Even the toys were handmade and simply constructed. With a notch here and there, a whimmy-diddle could turn and spin. Twirling and pulling a button on a string would captivate the attention of the mountaineer children. Children played, but women worked hard in their home. Foot-propelled spinning wheels were used to twist fiber strands into yarn. At a loom, shuttles carried weft yarn across warp so that patterns could be woven into cloth. It wasn't easy to wash the clothes they made. Using water from a nearby stream, clothes were scrubbed on a washboard using homemade lye soap. Folks did not have electricity as we do today, so they made candles to illuminate the house at night. The simplest candles were made by dipping the wicks repeatedly into a pot of melted wax. After each dipping, the candle was set aside to cool. When all work was done and it was time to sleep at the day's end, families snuggled down under warm quilts, artistically pieced together from scraps of cloth. This self-sufficiency and simple way of life seems romantic to most of us, but it meant hard work and long hours to survive. Soon, life in these mountain communities was to change. By the late 1800s, the natural resources of these woodlands became a commodity. To meet consumer demand across the nation for forest products, northern timber and paper pulp interests turned to the South Appalachians, and these companies bought thousands of acres of old-growth forests. As the railroads reached the mountains, it became economically possible to transport logs to sawmills and boards to market. But the exuberance over early logging had its consequences. Soil eroded, gullies washed out, and streams filled with silt. Forest slopes were depleted of their trees. The economy and ecology could not be sustained. But we did not know then what we know today. The Cradle of Forestry celebrates a century of conservation and the vision of the first pioneers of forestry. George Vanderbilt had a dream. It began in 1889 when he selected a site for a large estate he named Biltmore, and then decided to purchase and restore thousands of acres of damaged woodlands that surrounded his property. To help him pursue his plans, he hired a German forester, Carl Schenk. With a degree in forestry, Schenk had the knowledge and enthusiasm needed to begin the difficult process of rejuvenating the forests and soils. In 1898, Carl Schenk established a school, the first school of forestry in the nation. At the site of this school, now called the Cradle of Forestry in America, Schenk began to explore new forestry methods and conduct experiments with his students. The campus at Biltmore Forest School consisted of mountaineer cabins and farm homes, which once had been part of the community that sprung up in this area. Serving as both a church and school, this one-room community building became a classroom where in the morning, Schenk lectured. And in the afternoon, he led students to the field to test out applications of his theories. Since he was German, Schenk needed to learn more about American trees, so he experimented with different species in the school's tree nursery. He taught students about good forest management practices. Students worked 2 small sawmills to learn proper lumbering techniques and studied locomotive logging operations that worked to bring huge logs and supplies around the switchbacks of the hills. Down the trail from the schoolhouse is an opening in the forest where you see a commissary, built by Vanderbilt for his workers and those still living in the Pink Beds area. The forestry students bought supplies here and ate a quick lunch before going into their outdoor laboratory. Each student needed a horse so they could accompany Schenk on his lectures in the field. An engraved plaque sums up student sentiment.
Who is the man on a horse named Punch, riding along at the head of the bunch, giving no time to eat our lunch?
Schenk made sure there was a blacksmithing shop, so shoes on horses could be replaced and wagons and logging equipment could be repaired. Students lived in cabins left by earlier settlers or with Schenk's locally hired rangers. Ranger cabins were located where they could watch for game violators and unauthorized timber cutting. Schenk kept detailed records about the timber business, so he set up an office for himself in a small structure built from an abandoned barn. This is his desk, where he prepared his lecture outlines and texts, because there were no books on forestry by American authors at that time. Through his teaching efforts and practical applications, he hoped to conserve the forest for the future. 80,000 acres of Vanderbilt's estate eventually became part of the Pisgah National Forest. Later, Congress set aside 6,500 acres as the Cradle of Forestry in America to commemorate the beginning of forest conservation and education in the United States. The Cradle of Forestry lies in a high-elevation valley called the Pink Beds, which may get its name from the pink color that the mountain laurel and mountain phlox display in the spring and summer. As you follow its trails, a mix of different hardwoods and evergreens shade the floor of the woodland. Below the overstory grow mats of moss and lacy ferns. A unique feature of this area is the network of wetland bogs, which contain soils and plants that are very different from the communities surrounding them. Bogs are usually found on fairly flat terrain, where for various reasons, water enters the system faster than it leaves. Saturated with water for most of the year, many bogs have thick layers of spongy sphagnum moss underlain by deep layers of peat and black mud. Bogs, like other wetlands, are important because they act as natural water purification systems, filtering out silt and absorbing many pollutants. Look closely and you can see many examples of rare species, such as the swamp pink, golden club, and dewdrop, also known as robin runaway. This rare plant, with its leaves that resemble a small violet and its star-shaped white bloom, only grows in 3 North Carolina counties. Bogs also provide food and shelter for many animal and bird species. Living in the mud, grass, and sphagnum moss are rare bog turtles, North Carolina's smallest turtle. These wonderful places for plants and animals can be easily destroyed if water flow patterns are disturbed, for water is the lifeblood of a bog ecosystem. Mountain streams are where water and life begin. The Pisgah Center for Wildlife Education and Fish Hatchery, operated by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, emphasizes the importance of clean water to the environment, wildlife, and people. This center has many outdoor exhibits that focus on wildlife management, conservation, and fish culture. At the heart of the Wildlife Center is a trout rearing raceway, one of 3 cold water facilities in the state devoted to raising brook, rainbow, and brown trout. During the spawning season at the hatchery, ripe eggs are hand-stripped from female trout, and milt is stripped from the males. Once the eggs are gently mixed with the milt and fertilized, they are placed in incubation trays where they receive a constant flow of cool, clean water. The newly hatched fish changes and grows until it reaches a couple inches long. These fingerling trout are moved to outside raceways. When they've reached maturity, fish are placed in public trout waters. Each year, over 400,000 trout are stocked from the Pisgah Forest Fish Hatchery. Streams rush and trickle, and waterfalls sweep over rocks. Located along the route of this scenic byway are Pisgah's most striking landmarks. It's hard to imagine today that the byway actually follows the path of the main logging railroad that wound its way through the mountains in the early 1900s. 2 miles above the falls is Sliding Rock, where Looking Glass Creek spills 11,000 gallons of water a minute over this 60-foot-long natural rock. At the end of this, water splashes into a 6-foot-deep pool. In this soothing environment, with its natural falls and fish in the streams, its delicate plants and wildlife of the bogs, its mountains that softly recede to the horizon, all can continue to flourish if we protect the life of our forest heritage.